What would you do if they took your name? Not your life, your name, your identity. Everything you'd been told was forever. June the 12th, 1944, Normandy, France. 6 days after D-Day. Private Billy Charles, 19 years old, stood in a quiet sector near Vers-sur-Mer. In his hand, a cap badge. The wrong cap badge. A sergeant he'd never met, a Scotsman with an accent so thick Billy could barely understand, had just placed it in his palm. "You're not Durham anymore, son." 5 words. In that moment, Billy learned the first truth of war. Everything they'd promised was negotiable. Starting with who he was. This is his story. And by the end, you'll understand why he carried 2 badges in his wallet until the day he died. 59 years later, never speaking about them, never explaining them, just carrying them every single day. Billy's hands were shaking. He stared at the badge in his palm, brass, unfamiliar, still warm from the sergeant's pocket. The Cameronians, Scottish Rifles, a regiment he'd never heard of until 10 minutes ago. His own badge, the Durham Light Infantry, his regiment, was already unpinned, already gone. It sat in his other hand, cooling. 8 months he'd worn it. 8 months of believing the drill sergeant who'd told him over and over that his regiment was forever. 73 times. Billy had counted. Your regiment is your blood. Your mates are your brothers. That badge on your cap, that's who you are. Billy had believed it completely. The way 19-year-olds believe things, without question, without doubt, the way you believe the sun will rise. But here's what they hadn't mentioned. Forever could end on a Tuesday. Brotherhood was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. And that badge he'd worn with pride? Replaceable, negotiable, gone. The Durham Light Infantry had history reaching back to 1881. They'd fought at Dunkirk, in North Africa, in Sicily. Billy knew every battle honour, every tradition. The men in his training company had been from Durham. Same towns, same accents, same understanding of the world. His best mate had lived 3 streets from his cousin. They'd talked about pubs they both knew, soccer teams they both supported. That was supposed to be his war. Hard, certainly. Dangerous, absolutely. But his, with his people. Now he was being sent to strangers. To Scotsmen who spoke differently, thought differently, had their own history he knew nothing about. "Sew it on before nightfall," the sergeant said, already moving to the next Durham man in line, holding another badge that didn't belong. Billy looked down at the 2 pieces of brass in his hands. One he'd earned, one he'd been assigned. Both real, neither fitting. His fingers refused to move at first, just held them there, one in each palm, as if the weight of them could tell him which was true. But before we uncover how this impossible moment became the defining truth of Billy's war, a truth that shaped the next 59 years of his life, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Did your father or grandfather ever tell you about the moment that changed them? When did their forever end? Billy didn't know he was one of thousands. He didn't know that Britain was bleeding soldiers faster than anyone had predicted, that infantry casualties were running 80% higher than the planners had estimated, that men were dying faster than they could be replaced. He didn't know about the War Office meetings where they decided that regimental identity, the thing they'd told him was sacred, was now officially a luxury we can no longer afford. He just knew his badge was coming off, and with it, something fundamental about who he thought he was. Later, much later, when Billy was an old man sorting through memories the way others sort through photographs, he would tell his son Jim about this moment. "I was angry at them," Billy said, his voice quiet but steady, "for lying to us about forever, but I was angrier at myself." Jim had been sorting through his father's things, preparing for the funeral Billy had insisted be small. He stopped, waiting. "Because part of me had known," Billy continued. "When they showed us those training films with the perfect attacks and the reliable equipment, part of me knew it was too clean, too simple. But I wanted to believe it, because believing it meant I'd survive. believing it meant someone somewhere had a plan. He paused, the way old soldiers do when memory becomes too heavy. I was complicit in my own deception, Jim. We all were. Back on June 12th, 1944, Billy Charles was still 19, still believed in promises, and his fingers finally began to move. He unpinned his Durham badge. The brass left a small mark on his uniform, a clean spot where the fabric hadn't faded, the outline of what had been. The Cameronians' badge went on crooked the first time. His hands were shaking too badly. He had to remove it, try again, line it up, pin it straight. A veteran, a real Cameronian who'd been with them since North Africa, watched the Durham men with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Welcome to the Cameronians, Durham man," he said. His Glasgow accent was rough, foreign to Billy's ears. "We're all orphans here." Billy looked up. "How long have you been?" 2 years with them, 3 years before that with a regiment that doesn't exist anymore." The veteran's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You stop counting eventually. Start going by faces instead of badges." He handed Billy his needle and thread, a small gesture, but weighted with meaning Billy would only understand later. "The Scots aren't bad lads," the veteran continued. "Different, aye. But when the shells come in, we all bleed the same. That's what matters here. Not where you're from, not what badge you wear, just that you're here, and you keep the man next to you alive." Billy finished sewing, still crooked, but it would hold. "Is it always like this?" he asked, nothing being what they said. The veteran was quiet. In the distance, artillery rumbled, impossible to tell whose. "Son," he finally said, "everything they told you was designed to get you here. Now that you're here, now you learn what's actually true." Within 48 hours, Billy would learn exactly what actually true meant. He would learn about the equipment, the promises about reliable armor and working weapons. He would learn what veterans meant when they talked about machines that required prayer just to operate safely. And he would learn something else, something no training film mentioned. Something that would crack open everything he thought he understood about enemies and allies, and the simple categories that were supposed to make war make sense. But first there was the matter of surviving with a badge he didn't recognize, and men whose names he didn't yet know. First there was the matter of becoming someone else entirely. Billy's first real look at the universal carrier came 2 days later. It sat in a field near Crowley, mud-splattered and smaller than he'd expected. In the training films, the carriers had seemed substantial, protective. The narrator's voice confident, reliable infantry transport, capable of traversing difficult terrain while providing adequate protection. Billy ran his hand along the armor plating. It felt wrong, too thin, like touching something hollow when it should be solid. "She's yours," said MacLeod, the veteran from Glasgow. "Try not to die in her." Jaunt, Billy pulled out the borrowed caliper he'd gotten from an engineer that morning, started measuring, the metal under his fingers, 0.4 inches on the front, 0.3 on the sides. He measured again, certain he'd made a mistake. 0.4 inches. His mum had a biscuit tin at home where she kept buttons. Billy had opened it 1,000 times. He knew exactly how thin that metal was. This was thinner. MacLeod watched him smoking. "Told you, mobile coffin. But it moves, which is more than you can say for walking. And if you keep it moving, keep your head down, you might survive." Billy did the mathematics. He'd seen German rifles at demonstrations, knew their capabilities. A standard round could punch through this armor from 400 yards, maybe farther if the shooter was any good. That's when Billy started noticing other things. Small things at first, then bigger things, then everything. The PIAT, the revolutionary anti-tank weapon that was supposed to give them a fighting chance, nearly broke Billy's shoulder the first time he tried to cock it. Not in combat, in practice. "Use your whole body," Sergeant Campbell said. His Scottish accent clipped. "Lean back, put everything into it." Billy planted his feet, gripped the weapon, pulled. The spring mechanism resisted, then gave way violently. Billy stumbled backward. Pain shot through his shoulder. Sharp, immediate, wrong. The PIAT clattered to the ground. "Christ!" Billy gasped, clutching his arm. "Aye, that'll happen." Campbell picked up the weapon without sympathy. "The trick is to lean your whole body weight back and pray the spring doesn't slip. Saw a lad break his collarbone at training. The PIAT doesn't care if you're ready." Billy rotated his shoulder, testing it. Not broken, but strained. It would hurt for days. "How many things in war," Billy asked slowly, "require prayer just to operate?" Campbell looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, not with humour, but with recognition. "All of them, Durham man. Every single one." That night, Billy sat with other soldiers who'd been badge swapped. Durham men, Yorkshire men, men from regiments that no longer existed or had been folded into others. They shared a tin of bully beef none of them wanted to eat and discovered they all had the same question. What else is a lie? "The equipment," one of them said. "That's what gets me. Everything in the films worked perfectly. Everything was reliable. And then you're here, and the carrier's armour is tissue paper, and the PIAT breaks your bones." "It's not incompetence," another added quietly. "That's worse. Someone knew. Someone somewhere knew the equipment didn't match what they told us, and they sent us anyway." Billy touched his aching shoulder. "Because telling us the truth meant we might not go. Or we'd go scared, hesitant, not believing in the plan." Bitter laugh. "Can't have that. Better to send us confident with equipment that barely works than honest and too frightened to fight." One of the men, older, maybe 25, spoke quietly. "My father was at the Somme. Never talked about it. But once I found his medals, asked him about them." Pause. He said, "The medals are for what they told people we did. The truth is, what we don't talk about." "What does that mean?" Billy asked. "I think I'm starting to understand." Years later, historians would find a War Office memo from July 1944. It stated plainly, "Regimental identity, while valuable for morale in peacetime, is a luxury we can no longer afford given current manpower constraints." A luxury. The thing Billy had believed was forever, the thing they'd hammered into him 73 times, was officially a luxury. Dispensable, negotiable, like the 0.4-inch armour, like the PIAT that required prayer, like every promise they'd made. Billy was learning a pattern, the gap between what they said and what was true, between the training films and the reality, between forever and Tuesday. Decades later, Billy would tell Jim, "Part of me had known. When they showed us those training films, part of me knew it was too clean, but I wanted to believe because believing meant surviving." The pause. "I was complicit in my own deception. We all were." But there was something Billy didn't expect, something that training, honest or dishonest, could never prepare him for. Within days, he would discover that sometimes in the middle of organized violence and broken promises and equipment that barely worked, humanity persists in the strangest places. Sometimes the enemy remembers something your own side forgot. Sometimes the man trying to kill you is more honorable than the people who sent you both there. Billy Charles didn't know the term psychologists use for what he was experiencing, holding two contradictory truths in your mind, unable to reconcile them, feeling the mental friction of beliefs grinding against reality. He just lived it. The truth he'd been given. Your regiment is forever. Your equipment is reliable. Your enemy is inhuman. Your cause is just. The truth he'd discovered. None of that was simple. None of that was clean. And the worst truth, he was about to learn it from the enemy. It happened in late June. The exact date blurred in Billy's memory later. Time moved strangely in Normandy, some days lasting forever, while whole weeks compressed into nothing. But the moment itself stayed crystalline. They'd been holding a position along a sunken lane in the bocage country south of Bayeux. High hedgerows on both sides, thick enough to stop sightlines but not shells. The universal carrier was pulled against the western hedge, nose pointed toward what everyone hoped was safety. Douglas, a Cameronian who'd taken it upon himself to keep the Durham transfers alive, needed to relieve himself. Basic human necessity, the kind that doesn't pause for war. "Cover me," he said, already moving. "Won't be a minute." He stepped around the carrier, found privacy behind a thicker section of hedge, began to unbutton. Billy lifted his binoculars out of habit. Scanning, always scanning. That's what kept you alive, constant vigilance. That's when he saw the German sniper, 300 yards out, maybe less, in a stone farm building with half its roof gone. Billy couldn't see the man clearly, just shadow, movement, the angle of a rifle barrel catching light before disappearing. The rifle was pointed at Douglas. Billy's heart stopped. He couldn't shout. That would only confirm the target. Couldn't shoot back. Too far for his rifle and firing would alert the sniper. Couldn't move to help. By the time he crossed the distance, it would be over. All he could do was watch. Douglas was completely vulnerable. Trousers undone, attention elsewhere, posture relaxed in the way bodies relax when basic needs override military caution. The sniper had all the time in the world. Perfect shot. Stationary target. Clear sight line. No possibility of return fire before he could relocate. Billy waited for the crack of the rifle. 5 seconds. 10, 15. Douglas finished. Buttoned up, stretched his back, completely unaware. The rifle in the farm building didn't move, didn't fire. The shadow stayed still, watching, not shooting. Douglas walked back to the carrier. "All right?" he asked Billy, noticing something in his expression. Billy lowered the binoculars. His hands were shaking again. "Yeah, all right." He didn't mention the sniper. Didn't mention the shot that could have been taken. Wasn't sure how to explain something he didn't understand himself. 2 days later, they found the sniper's position when the line pushed forward. Empty now, abandoned in good order. No panic, no hasty retreat. Just a professionally vacated firing position. Clean sight lines. Spent brass removed. A half-smoked cigarette, carefully stubbed out on stone. MacLeod examined it with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read battlefields. "Good spot," he said, pointing. "Could see the whole approach. Could have taken dozens of shots." "Why didn't he?" Billy asked. "Why do you think?" Billy thought about Douglas. Vulnerable, unaware, human. "Some things," MacLeod said quietly, "stay sacred, even here, even in this. Shooting a man when he's like that, when he's at his most human, some lines you don't cross." "But he'd have shot him any other time." "Aye, any other time, absolutely. That's the job." MacLeod paused. "But there's job, and there's something else. Can't quite name it. The part of you that stays human when everything around you is designed to make you less than human." Billy thought about that for a long time. Years later, Billy would say something that sounded strange coming from a Normandy veteran. "That German sniper was more honourable than the people who sent us both there, with equipment that barely worked and promises that weren't worth the paper they were printed on." The cruelest irony. Billy's enemy had shown more humanity than his own side. The German soldier who didn't shoot Douglas had kept something intact. Some line, some code, some sliver of the world that was. But the people who gave Billy a badge that wasn't his, who put him in a carrier with armour like a biscuit tin, who told him forever and meant until Tuesday. They'd crossed every line that mattered. Billy never became a Cameronian. Not really, not in his heart. But he became something else. Something without a name or a badge. He became a man who questioned, who looked at official reports and asked what they weren't saying, who heard heroic speeches and wondered whose sons were being sent to die this time. It made him a difficult man sometimes. Jim remembers his father walking out of a cinema once in the early 1980s, just stood up during a war film and left. Jim followed him out, found him in the lobby, breathing hard. What's wrong? They got it wrong. What wrong? Everything. The fear, the waiting, how men actually die. Billy's voice was tight. They made it look meaningful, like it meant something in the moment, like there was clarity. And there wasn't? No. Billy shook his head. The meaning comes after. If you're lucky enough to have an after. In the moment, it's just chaos and confusion and equipment that doesn't work. And trying not to die before you understand what's happening. Pause. The meaning, the narrative, that's what we build later, to make it bearable, to make it fit into a story we can live with. Billy carried those contradictions for the rest of his life, never resolved them, never chose between the truth he'd been given and the truth he'd discovered, between the promise and the reality, between the enemy's honor and his own side's betrayals. He just carried everything. And in carrying it, he became what the training films never mentioned, a man who'd learned to hold contradictions without resolution, to see complexity without paralysis, to recognize that truth and lies can wear the same uniform. That was Billy's war, not the battles or the ground taken or the enemy killed. His war was learning to live with what couldn't be reconciled. Billy Charles died on March 17th, 2003. He was 78 years old. The funeral was small. He'd wanted it that way, specified it in the quiet, methodical manner of a man who'd learned you can't control much, but you can control how you leave. On his coffin, they placed the 2 cap badges. Durham Light Infantry, the Cameronians. Not 1. 2. Jim stood at the front of the church, looking at those 2 pieces of brass catching light through stained glass, and he understood. One badge represented who Billy thought he'd be. The other represented who he'd been forced to become. And the space between them, that was the war. That was the truth. That was the distance between promise and reality. When Jim sorted through his father's effects, he found the wallet, old brown leather, worn soft by decades in a back pocket. Inside a few pounds. His mum's wedding photo. Pictures of grandchildren, a library card, and 2 cap badges wrapped carefully in cloth so they wouldn't scratch the photographs. They'd been there every single day for 59 years. Every time Billy bought groceries. Every time he paid for fish and chips on Friday nights. Every time he pulled out pictures of grandchildren, telling their names with quiet pride. The badges were there, touching, carrying on their silent argument in the dark. Durham and Cameronians, promise and reality. The person he was and the person he became. Both real, both his. Jim thought about all those ordinary moments, thousands of them, spanning 6 decades. His father at the corner store, his father at the pub, his father buying candy for grandchildren. And every single time, those 2 badges were there. Not in a frame on a wall, not in a drawer with other memorabilia. In his wallet, with him, always. That's how memory actually works. Not in monuments, but in the things we carry every day, the weight we feel even when we're not thinking about it. There's a museum in Durham now, a frame in a quiet corner, 2 cap badges on dark velvet, side by side. The plaque reads, worn by Private William Billy Charles, 1943 to 1945. Both identities, both truths, both real. Jim donated them 6 months after the funeral. Couldn't keep them in the house. The weight was too much. Not physical weight, something else. But he visits sometimes. Brings his children to see the grandfather they remember as a quiet man who grew vegetables and never talked about the war. Which one was he really? His daughter asks. Jim gives the answer his father taught him. Both. That's the point. According to military records, thousands of soldiers experienced what Billy Charles experienced. The policy saved the Normandy campaign. Historians agree on this. Without the ability to rapidly redistribute personnel, the British Second Army would have collapsed from manpower shortages by mid-July 1944. Strategically necessary, operationally essential. But it broke something that doesn't show up in casualty reports. Post-war, veterans' reunions became complicated. Which regiment were you, really? Became a question without simple answers. Some men chose one identity and buried the other. Simpler that way, cleaner story. Billy kept both, because choosing between them would mean admitting one was more real than the other, and they were both real. The Durham badge represented the promise that brought him to war. The Cameronians badge represented the reality that kept him alive. Choosing would be choosing between truth and truth, so he carried both. Let them argue. Let them contradict. Let them remind him every day for 59 years that identity isn't simple. And war doesn't offer clean narratives. Identity isn't what we're given. It's what we endure with. Billy became a Cameronian not by choice, but by living through what would have killed the soldier he was before June 12th, 1944. He wore their badge, fought alongside their men, survived. But he never stopped being Durham either. Never stopped carrying that first identity, the one that represented home and promise, and the person he'd been when forever seemed like forever. War's greatest casualty isn't always life. Sometimes it's the person you believed you were. Sometimes it's the gap between that person and who you actually became. Sometimes it's the distance between what we're promised and what we carry. Billy carried two badges for 59 years because neither one told the complete truth. Together, they told something closer, not the whole truth. War is too complicated for whole truths, but a truer truth. The truth of contradictions lived daily. The truth of promises broken and identities forced, and the stubborn human insistence on staying human anyway. The truth of a 19-year-old boy whose hands shook while sewing on a stranger's badge, who became a 78-year-old man who never stopped carrying that moment, who taught his son that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to pretend it all makes sense. That's what war does. It doesn't choose for you. It makes you carry everything.